Welcome to Enroute, the podcast of the First Responder Behavioral Health Institute. The First Responder Behavioral Health Institute is bringing together some of the most inspiring and dedicated change agents in the global public safety, psychotherapy, and educational communities. Each episode of Enroute seeks to bring together first responder change agents and clinicians dedicated to constructively disrupting the status quo by tackling the tough subjects like first responder suicide, post-traumatic stress, moral injury, sanctuary trauma, leadership development, critical incident response, peer support teams, and what it means to be psychologically safe and healthy while working in an unsafe world. All units, please stand by. The Enroute podcast is about to begin. You can resume normal traffic on this channel after this transmission. Welcome to this edition of Enroute. I'm Joseph Burgundy. Conrad Weaver is a documentary filmmaker who has dedicated his life to telling stories that matter, stories that make a difference, and stories that define the many problems we all face in tangible ways that help us to better understand the situation, and they position us to take action and engage solutions. PTSD 911 is a powerful new documentary that explores the story of first responders and the stress of the job from interviews with first responders who are struggling to cope with the impact of repetitive trauma exposure. The documentary serves as a message of hope to first responders and the community, helping us to better understand that healing is possible, and it examines the risks of not taking care of yourself and failing to recognize and respond to the signs of declining mental health. Conrad exposes us to the human behind the uniform and the struggles and stigmas first responders face when seeking help. First responders take care of us on our worst days, and this film asks some important questions. Who will take care of them? And how do we create a culture of wellness within our organizations? This film inspires lasting systemic change, ending stigmas, and it raises awareness of the work that still needs to be done, normalizing and understanding that it's okay to not be okay. Please join me in welcoming Conrad Weaver to this episode of Enroute. Conrad Weaver, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Enroute. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a privilege to be here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. For the people that don't have the privilege of knowing you and your work and your background, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about you?
Yeah, well, I'm a documentary filmmaker and a podcast host. I'm a husband, I'm a dad, and now a grandfather. As the people that have seen me recently said, you look like Santa Claus. Well, not quite. But yeah, I'm a filmmaker primarily. I tell stories that matter. That's kind of my motto that I live by. And I help people to discover purpose and meaning through the podcast that I produce. And I really enjoy that kind of work. I love storytelling, and stories that matter, I think, can help change the world. And so I've had the privilege of telling stories that matter for the past number of maybe 10, 15 years. And so I find stories that are interesting that aren't being told, perhaps, or at least the pieces of the stories that I'm telling aren't being told. And so I dive deep into those cultures to be able to tell a story. And so, that's what I do. I've got a degree in psychology, and fortunately that kind of helps on some of the recent projects that I've worked on. So that's kind of in a nutshell who I am and what I do.
Beautiful. What inspired you to be a storyteller in the first place? Was there something in your youth, a story you loved, or how'd you get started?
You know, I think it comes just from loving story. I remember when I was in elementary school, we had a principal who would gather it was a small school, would gather the entire school together on afternoons. I think maybe it was a Thursday afternoon, and he'd read from a book. And he told a story. And I loved that. And then being around my father was a pastor, and so we'd often have guests staying with us, and me and my siblings would sit on the stairs listening in to the adults' conversation and the stories they would tell. And so I think that my love of story comes from those things that from my childhood, where I loved listening to stories. I loved hearing stories. And ironically, the culture that I grew up in a Mennonite community. And so I didn't even have television or I never went to a movie until I was in my 20s. And so that wasn't a part of my growing up. It was all these stories from books or stories from just verbal stories that people would share with each other. And I think that's really where the root of my love of story comes.
And your love of stories went into visual storytelling and broadcasting, documentary film work. How did you make that transition over there, especially when you came from a culture and a time when you weren't exposed to the visual medium?
Yeah, interestingly, so in my childhood growing up, I grew up with a camera in my hand, a photography camera, and my father taught me how to shoot pictures. And with back in those days, we used film. And so I learned how to shoot photos. And then I was, my life, I got a degree in psychology, took various, kind of turns with that, with my career, and ended up working at a church, and where they decided they wanted to start doing video for their services. And they said, Conrad, is this something you can do? And so I said, well, I've never done it, but I can try. And I discovered a new love, and we started producing videos and started capturing little stories from people whose lives were changed. And I love that. I love that aspect of having someone sitting in front of a camera telling their story and being able to share that with the audience then, and seeing people's hearts and minds moved when these stories were told. And so that's where that came out of. And then one day I was sitting at my computer at my home office, and I was reading this blog. And it was a blog about these farmers, these harvesters who travel. They live in their RV. They go down to Texas every May, and they harvest wheat. And they travel across the plains from Texas all the way up to Montana or North Dakota. And they harvest the farmers' wheat. And I was reading this blog, and my wife looked over my shoulder and she said, "You should make a movie about that." And that launched my career in documentary filmmaking. So I made a movie about that, and we were very fortunate. We played on some PBS channels and won a nice trophy that's on my shelf. And I really fell in love with documentary filmmaking and that form of storytelling. And so I started looking for my next story after that film was done, and one film leads to another, and that's what led me to my most recent project, PTSD 911. And this is probably as you make films, as you create projects, you learn. And because I never went to film school, never studied these things, and so I had to learn. And I look back at my early work and I'm like, oh my goodness, that really needs some work to get better. And so I became a better storyteller as the years went on. And I feel that PTSD 911 is my best work to date. And it certainly wasn't an easy project to make. And we can get into that a little bit later. But it really is my current favorite project. My most favorite project is my first one. It's kind of like that first car you have, that's my favorite thing, but my first documentary, and that one won the Emmy. So it's kind of has a special place in my heart too.
Nice. Well, I absolutely love your storytelling, and that storytelling and the passion you put in your work is what brought us together today, because I have brought you here to talk to our members and our viewers about post-traumatic stress disorder, first responder wellness. It is a subject that is near and dear to my heart as both a first responder and a mental health clinician. So tell us a little bit about what made that story come into your awareness, and maybe a little bit about the production process in the background.
Sure. Well, in 2016, I was just wrapping up I started working on a film about the opioid crisis. And as we know, that's been a huge crisis around the country, around the world, really. And that that came close to a friend of mine's son was impacted by that. And so we started talking about that. And she said, hey, I'll help you make a film about that. And so we produced a documentary. It's called Heroine's Grip. And it was all filmed locally here. And as a part of that production, I was doing ride-alongs. I was with law enforcement. I was with the sheriff's department, the police department, and fire and EMS services. And we would I was there in case there was an overdose. And sure enough, one day, the call came through that there was an overdose and lights and sirens, and we're off and running. And by the time we got to the scene, we got word that is a fatal overdose. And so 32-year-old woman, a heroin user, and she was laying deceased in the bathroom. And that's not something that I'm familiar with or comfortable seeing and experiencing. And as I looked around and watched the medics and the law enforcement officers on scene, their response was, it's just Tuesday. It's just another day. And so that got me interested in how do traumatic scenes impact our first responders? And so I started researching this and uncovered this whole issue. And so I went back to the officer I was with that day and said, hey, do you guys have PTSD? Is that a thing with first responders? And she said, oh my goodness, if you only knew the half. And then she said, if you want to make a documentary about that, I'll do anything I can to help you tell that story. Not realizing she would become one of the main characters in the film that is now called PTSD 911. And so that's what really launched that film. And I started working on, okay, who else has this issue? And so we launched a website that where people could submit their stories, and we started hearing stories from all over the country. I have a co-producer who worked with me, and she vetted those stories to see if it's a story we want to include in our film. And we landed on Desiree, the officer who I was with that day here locally here in Maryland, and then Maddie, the firefighter out of Anaheim, California, and then Nicole, the dispatcher who was originally from Boston. And so those are the three main subjects in our film. And we decided to work with them over the course of the several years to kind of track their journey. And that's what we did. And so it was a little scary because we didn't know where it was going to end and where it was going to land and where these stories are going to end. And so that's kind of a risk you take when you tell these stories. And so their stories appear in the film along with agencies and organizations and there's a few other people that we included as well, kind of in the middle of the film. There's little vignettes that has some other police officers, some other firefighters included in this film. But we also wanted to share with our audience, what are some agencies doing that are doing things well, or perhaps better than others? And so we found some agencies that are doing amazing work in the area of wellness and officer wellness and firefighter wellness. And so we included their stories to showcase, okay, this is how an agency could be managed. This is how wellness could show up in your agency. And so we felt it's really important to share that with the audience so that they can be inspired to, hey, if they can do it over there in Garland, Texas, then we can probably do it here in Tupelo, Mississippi. And that's really what we wanted to do. And then even with the first responders, all three of the first responders that we worked with, they have tattoos all over the place. They're tough, but yet they were vulnerable enough to be willing to share their stories. And I take that very seriously. When I stick a camera in someone's face and I spend time with them, like Maddie, I was there on a day he had a panic attack, and he allowed me to film that and to document that and then talk about it afterwards. And so there's some powerful scenes like that really show the reality of the impact of the traumas that first responders experienced. And so that's what we do with this film.
Nice. And nicely said. And one of the things I truly appreciated is you covered the world of dispatch. Mm-hmm. People don't seem to have a concept, and I've often articulate this when I speak, that they are actually the first responders.
Absolutely. And that wasn't on my radar to start with, to be honest. It wasn't part of the film originally. And I was talking with a local firefighter here in Maryland, And he's also the president of our local fire company. And he said, well, have you thought about dispatch and 911? I said, well, tell me about that. And his full-time job is a dispatcher. He said, well, we hear it, we imagine it with our brain, and then we often don't get closure. And so it becomes a problem. And so I was like, oh, wow, this is certainly, you are the first responders. And so that's what made us say, hey, let's find a first responder who is willing to tell their story. And we found Nicole, who ultimately has a really powerful story. She was a part of the Boston Marathon bombing event in Boston, was a dispatcher on that, or a call taker on that event, and so was deeply impacted by that, as well as some the incidents that she handled with some of the other agencies that she worked for. And we can talk about this later, but there's a wrap-up story to her story that I want to share perhaps a little later in our conversation today.
Excellent. And you bring up and highlight something very important. People don't understand as a complex trauma specialist and working in that space. One of the best books written is by Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score. And he lets us know that these things aren't in resident memory. It's in the smells. It's in the sounds. As you said before, first responders are very tough, very resilient. They have trained themselves to stare some very ugly things right in the face. It is the sounds that take them. It's the blood-curdling scream of a mother who has just lost her child. It is the sounds of somebody that you're trying to get help to on a 911 dispatch line, and you can't see them and you're not there. But the trauma of everything that happens and is happening is flowing through your body as you're trying to stay calm, get that information down. And then you have to be very clear in your articulation of this to units that are responding. And people just don't seem to have a grasp of that. And in the trauma suite, people are often surprised they can't tell me their stories. It starts by how you feel. It starts with a smell, or why are you here today? Because I heard something, and it reminded me of the war. There was a backfire, and we were out with friends, and I'm underneath a car, and I got back from Afghanistan last year. So, and they're like, but I wasn't consciously, there's nothing conscious in the trauma response. It's all wired into the amygdala and that aspect of the brain where they're not thinking about it. It's just in their system and in their soul. And it's
I had an old-time volunteer firefighter who told me when I was first working on this project, he told me that, and he's retired now, but he said, we're in a small community here in Maryland, and we have a volunteer fire station, and they still turn on the whistle, the siren to alert the community when there's something going on. And he said when that siren goes off, he said, it takes me back to when I was a young firefighter. I was the first one into a burning home, and we had to look for a mother and her baby who were deceased in the home. And he said, when that siren goes off, I still smell that smell. And so it's a really powerful thing for these first responders. They carry that with them, many all the way to the end of their lives, unfortunately. And so it's something that can really deeply impact a person's life.
Absolutely. Now, you went on a journey to understand wellness in the first responder community and how different communities operate. What were some of the takeaways there? I'm out there trying to go ahead and get them to put in peer support and wellness programs, and I'm met with mixed results at times. So you've seen, all types of systems. What did you learn?
Yeah, I've seen the good, bad, and the ugly in this. There are organizations and agencies that are doing amazing work. One of my favorite is CAL FIRE in California. They start at the academy to teach wellness and mental health resilience. They told me that before we teach a firefighter how to throw a ladder or pull a hose, we talk about the brain. And we talk about how this job affects them, and we teach them yoga, we teach them breathing techniques, we teach them these coping mechanisms that they can use, and we're putting tools into their tool belt. so that when they get on the fire scene, they have these tools readily available to use to calm their nerves, to calm their anxieties, to be able to focus, to do the things that they are trained to do then with the hard work of fighting a fire or cutting someone out of a car or whatever it is that they have to do. They're prepared for that mentally as well as physically. And I think that's a really powerful way to, I think every agency should start at the academy to teach these things. And very often it's not. The old firefighter I mentioned earlier, I asked him what their extent of their training was. And he said, our training was suck it up, here's a beer. And that's what they learned, and consequently we have alcoholism is a huge problem in our first responder community.
Yeah, I unfortunately came up in that system, and you're right. Any form of emotional expression or an acknowledgement of the pain and suffering of having handled a difficult call was seen and interpreted as a sign of weakness. Mm-hmm. And you're right, our substance abuse is through the roof in many agencies.
Yeah, and the one police agency that we showcase in the film is Garland Police Department in Garland, Texas. It's an agency with about 300 to 400 sworn officers. They have a full-time officer who is their wellness officer. They have a chief who believes in wellness, who believes that a brain injury, a mental health issue, they treat it exactly the same as they would a knee injury or if you broke your wrist. If you have to be out of work to go get treatment, if you have to go out of work for 30 days to go to a substance abuse clinic or for a recovery center, you have your job when you come back. Go get better, go get well, take care of yourself. You have a job when you come back. And that is very rare in our country. I think we're seeing a trend that is moving toward that, but historically that's very rare for anyone in law enforcement, especially at the top, to acknowledge that, hey, these things do impact our members, and we're going to treat a mental health issue just the same as we would any other type of physical injury. And I remember hearing one psychiatrist said that mental health issues. Psychiatry is the only medicine that doesn't actually look at what's broken or look at what's wrong. And this particular doctor has developed a system that he can do brain scans and he can look at it and kind of analyze what's going on with an individual. But it's so true. We don't see what's wrong in our brain, so we don't think that it's actually something that can be fixed or should be treated the same as a knee injury. But it really is. It's if our brain is not well, it's the same as our knee is not well. And let's do the things that we need to do to fix that, to help that. And I think more and more agencies need to learn to do that. If we're going to continue to have healthy first responders, then we need to provide those kind of resources for them to get the help that they need when there's mental health issues.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. And regrettably, I've seen case study after case study and had experiences with first responders where the leadership actually contributed to the crisis. One in particular that I recall often is a firefighter paramedic, worked with a fairly large scale fire department in the state of Texas, and had suffered an injury, went off to the IAFF Center for Excellence, a brilliantly run, highly skilled substance abuse facility, completed every aspect of what he was being asked to do there, had met with me twice a week in excess of 6 months. It takes a lot for me to write a letter in support of reinstatement, a period, to go ahead and document care. But I did in this instance because I had seen the tremendous amount of work that was put forward by this individual, only to have the city say, "No, never mind, you're out of here."
Wow.
And we wonder why first responder suicidality tends to go through the roof.
Right.
Yeah. It's in this poor.
Yeah, and according to the national FOP, their recent research have found that institutional stress is really the top stressor for law enforcement officers. It comes from within the organization, and if some of these issues, like you just mentioned, can be solved, I think we would see the stress level in our first responders and many of them that stress level would be decreased. And so it's a leadership issue for many of these places. And I know that a leadership guru has said that everything rises and falls on leadership. And I think that this issue, this a complex issue, is no exception. That if we can get leaders to understand these things, then we can make a difference in the lives of the people who take care of our communities. And if we have healthy first responders responding to the community's issues, then we're going to have a better, healthier community.
Here, here. You know, when I teach this stuff, I see everything through the psychological lens, because that's the choice I made in the training and that which got me to the road to wellness. But people often forget leaders are promoted from within because you're a great cop. You're a great firefighter. But we sometimes fail to recognize that leadership itself, leadership development, organizational development, or the old school term, industrial psychology, are terms to describe a psychological discipline, and that it takes training and time to learn how to be a good leader. They're not born, they're made. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, sometimes they're made through an awful lot of trial and error. Mm-hmm. With leadership development, or the lack of it, when we see people who are suffering under the weight of poor leaders, toxic leadership, terms are starting to come out. Moral injury, sanctuary trauma. The Canadians developed that one, and I think it fits. The term being that you sanctuary, you went there for help, and instead of getting help, you were further traumatized by having sought help. What are some of your experiences documenting and listening to some of those stories?
Yeah, and really all three of the subjects in my film experience some of that institutional trauma. The police officer in my film, she, was basically pushed to the side and was really treated poorly among some of the people that were her leaders. And that just added to the compound stress. And then we had, our dispatcher in our film. She, ended up having some issues with hearing, and then was just dismissed from her agency with no real explanation. The head of HR was like, "Yeah, we can't really tell you why, but you're gone." And so that weighs on someone's mind. What did I do? Am I is something wrong with me that I'm not able to have this job anymore? And so those kind of things are just tragic. And I think recently I had Dr. Rita Brock on my show on the podcast, she's a leading expert on moral injury. We talked extensively about that. And so I really encourage people to jump over there to hear her take on that. She's a psychologist, and she works with the Organization Volunteers of America, and they do a lot of research on the subject of moral injury. And so I'm not an expert in that, so I can't really describe exactly what it is, but it has to do with your moral conscience and how that has been damaged. And so that is something that not only PTS or PTSD, PTSI can happen with someone, but you can also have that moral injury that takes some effort to be healed. And so I think the people that are in my film, I think they've experienced not only the PTSD, the injury, but also I think they've had moral injury as well.
Mm-hmm. And I think we naturally compound it by the way we conduct ourselves as first responders. We talk about the first responder family. We're always going to be there for you, no matter what. Mm-hmm. And certainly if you die in the line of duty, there's death benefits for your kids. Mm-hmm. People are going to make sure that they're there for your family. But if somebody goes out for a behavioral health issue, we turn the other way. We interviewed Michael Segru a few episodes back, who was medically released, and instead of having a party for him, they just mailed him his retirement badge. So much for being a part of the family. Now goodbye.
Yeah. Well, the officer that's in my film, she never even got her retirement badge. Yeah. It's like, why?
Yeah.
She did 22 years.
Yeah. And she certainly deserves that recognition and, that symbol of her service.
Yeah.
But that's what I see compounded in the treatment suite. We're certainly, they're coming in because something has happened. There's a trauma that brought you through my door. And we're working through that. But when my index of suspicion goes up for suicidality and the hairs stand up on the back of my neck, that we may have a critical situation of suicide on our hands, it's always the stories of how the leadership is navigating this issue and the care that they're not providing. But yet, with You Fall Off a Ladder, we have 14 pages of protocol on how to get you back into service and your PT and your OT and how we're going to go ahead and navigate that injury. But, there is a fear, and I think it's the fear of the unknown. As the psychiatrist you mentioned said, it's an area that we don't necessarily get to look into the brain and see what's actually going on, although we're finally starting to get the tools and the MRI machines and the documentation to see what's actually happening in there. But because they can't see it and they don't understand it maybe at the level they need to, they don't understand how recoverable it is. I look at this thing in 4 levels. Cancer doctor talked to me about that. He's like, Joseph, there's 4 levels of cancer. Like the last one's terminal. I got to do nothing but provide some last minute support on their way out of here. If someone were to come into my office with stage 1 or 2 cancer, highly treatable. I found the same to be true of post-traumatic injury, that if they get in early in their career, which they're not going to do if it's stigmatized to come get help, most of the time, if somebody's still in that post-traumatic injury stage, before we hit an actual definition of post-traumatic stress disorder or traumatic-related disassociation, those later stages, highly treatable, highly recoverable, and they can return to work and stay on the job. One of our faculty members, and we treasure his service, Mark Bouchard with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. He's one of their, they call it ERT. It's their term for SWAT team officers. He's also a paramedic up there. And had a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, came back from that diagnosis, is still a SWAT operator today, still functioning for the RCMP at high levels. But when he came out and told him he needed help, they did not know what to do with that. There were people in the agency that tried to make him go away, people in the agency that offered enormous amount of support. And his book, Setting Your Sights on Stigma, Thoughts from an Injured Mind, comes out this month. And I'm proud to say that I know him, and I'm also proud to acknowledge that they're moving him into a wellness officer role because he serves as an example for a truth that I've been trying to get our leaders to understand for a long time. Post-traumatic stress injury is as treatable and recoverable as a broken knee, a broken leg. That's not an easy treatment. That could take months of OT and PT to get through it, but it's treatable, it's recoverable.
Absolutely. And you have to choose, and as an individual, you have to choose your hard. I've worked with people who, are just really suffering from a lot of trauma and they have a choice to make. They have a choice. They can stay in that suffering state or they can do the hard work to get better. And it is difficult. It's a long, difficult journey. And some of the folks that are in my film have experienced that. I mean, Maddie, you have these journeys where you're on a better path and you're doing well, and then something happens and you fall off the wagon. In fact, in the middle of our production, we were probably halfway through production, about 1.5 years in. Maddie called me one day and he said, I just want to let you know you probably don't want to have me in your film anymore. I'm like, why? He said, well, I fell off the wagon. His drug of choice was alcohol, and he had been sober. And he said, I picked up again. My wheels are falling off and things aren't going well. I said, Maddie, that's exactly why I want you in the film, because it's a journey. It's not, I'm not going to button this up in a pretty bow and say everything's all hunky dory and well. No, it's a struggle. It's a journey. And so, and he appreciated that. He appreciated that I just didn't cast him to the curb because he was, in a bad place again. And fortunately, he's in a really good place now. But it took a long time to get there. Yeah. And so it is a journey. It's a lot of ups and downs, a lot of spills, and a lot of sideways movement. But if you keep at it and do the hard work, you have to choose your hard.
Yeah, you sure do. And speaking of this journey and speaking of your work, Let's go ahead and show them the introductory segment so they can go ahead and take a look at your documentary, and we'll talk about how to find it when we come back right after this. Take a look, everybody.
After working for 20 plus years as a police officer, not having backup is kind of scary. While I was trying to heal from the traumas that had put me in the position that I was in, I suddenly lost all the support of all the guys I worked with.
Just because we don't see it doesn't mean that we don't picture it in our head. I never thought that I would have to deal with that type of call, and I was not prepared.
I remember the moment I was like, okay, I was up all night. It was just trauma after trauma after trauma. You know, the novelty of the job wore off really quick.
They didn't offer any help. They said I needed to see a psychiatrist, that there was probably nothing wrong with me, that I was just being a baby about it.
I couldn't think of how to get help without ruining my job.
I know personally, on many occasions, that a police officer could go in and ask for help, and the chief would fire him.
They forced me to resign because they just could not understand how that could have affected me since I was just a dispatcher.
I just thought to myself, if I can't do this job, what can I do? What else? I put all the eggs in this basket. Who am I if I'm not a firefighter?
I have, 4 years till retirement, and I gotta be okay, and I gotta make it.
A powerful segment and a deep and meaningful documentary. Tell us a little bit more about the important things. How do we go ahead and access this, sign up to see it, and use it in our agencies?
Yeah, for the last year and even now and continuing into the future, the film is available for agencies to purchase, and we've really been encouraging agencies to have the film as a tool that they can use for training within their agency. And so the film is available now through the website. They can purchase that. But not only is it the film, but we're also providing other additional resources in some interviews that are not in the film, longer cuts of interviews that we have in the film that we felt were important. And so those are all available. We call that the digital toolkit. So when an agency purchases the film, they also get the digital toolkit, and as well as resources from some of our partners, including the National Alliance on Mental Illness, the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation, ICISF. The National FOP has provided some resources, and some of those organizations that we work with have provided documents that are in the toolkit that people can download, that agencies can download. And so that has been available. We've sold tons and tons and tons of those to agencies around the country, big and small agencies. We even have organizations, state agencies, for example, this past week, the Wisconsin Department of Justice, the DOJ in Wisconsin, purchased the film for their statewide agency, and they're putting it on their intranet so their members can actually access the film and the resources there. And so we encourage people to do that. And we're happy to announce that the general public can now access the film, and it is available on Amazon Prime Video. There's a small fee to download it or to view it or to rent it. But we encourage people to go to Amazon Prime Video to search for PTSD 911. You'll find it, and it's available there for the general public as well.
Very nice. Now tell me a little bit about your future projects and how you're moving this conversation forward. What's the future journey for PTSD 911 and you?
Yeah, so the future is currently I host the First Responder Wellness Podcast. I had launched this podcast under a different name back when I was in production for the film, and then we had to put it on pause so I could actually finish the film and have time to do that, because a podcast takes a lot of work to produce. So we relaunched a few weeks ago. I think we're in episode 11 right now. that it's called the First Responder Wellness Podcast. And it's kind of conversations with first responder leaders, mental health providers, to really help move that conversation forward and to bring subject matter experts to the microphone, to our channel, that can talk about these things, that can really encourage organizations to have a culture of wellness. And that's really kind of the talking points we really encourage: to move your organization to have a culture of wellness. And what does that look like? What does that mean? And so we've had some amazing people on the program, got some amazing interviews that we've already recorded that'll be kind of metered out over the next number of months. So the show drops every Wednesday morning at midnight Eastern time. So if you're on the East Coast or on the West Coast, you get it a little bit early. So it drops every Wednesday, and we'll continue that as long as there's interest and there's people listening. So it's also available on our YouTube channel. If you go to YouTube and search PTSD 911 movie, you will find the interviews there. We originally were putting it on another video platform behind a paywall, but we decided to move it over to the YouTube channel so that so everybody can see it for free. And so you can find it on Apple Podcasts, on all the places where podcasts are downloaded. You can find it there, or you can go to YouTube and see it there.
Nice.
So I did allude to something early on in our conversation about one of our people in the film, and this is a really hard subject to talk about, and it's about suicide. In the production of the film, that was always a concern, that one of our main subjects would choose to end their life. And fortunately, in the production of the film, that didn't happen. So that's not in the film at all. But a number of months ago, our dispatcher, Nicole, she had moved from the state she was living in South Dakota, back home to her home state of Maine, and was, unbeknownst to many of us, was still carrying a really heavy burden, heavy thing. And in August of this year, she chose to end her own life. And it was a real kick in the stomach for us because we had become good friends. She was well connected in the 911 community. A lot of people in the 911 organizations around the country knew of her. And it happened during the week of of a big convention for the 911 community. And so the shock waves of that rippled across that convention center. And it was a really kick in the teeth for us to have to deal with that. But it gave me a renewed sense of urgency that this subject matter is so important, and this film is so important to help move this conversation so that we can save lives. And Nicole, she apparently couldn't see the future, couldn't see hope. And I want people to realize that there is hope. There is a future. There is help available. You are not alone. And, she had thousands of people she could have reached out to. And initially for me, the first thought was, I should have called her more. I should have sent her another text. I should have, but then I soon realized that I can't save everybody. And I think there's a time when there's many first responders who become therapists who then reach back to help the next person, and they get that feeling that they have to save everybody. In fact, I had a friend of mine who was in the recovery community. He was a former heroin user and was now in the recovery community. And at one point he told me, he said, I can't turn my phone off because if I do, someone may die. And I wanted to take him and say, look, you cannot save everybody. Yeah. And that is absolutely what I had to learn even with Nicole's death, that, yeah, I can't save everybody. But I want people to know that Nicole's story mattered, and it still matters. Her life mattered, and it still matters. In fact, one of our screening events, just a week after her funeral, a gentleman came up to me and said, I want you to know that Nicole saved my life. I said, please tell me about that. And he said, she was on a podcast telling her story a couple years ago, and I heard her story, and I was motivated to go get help. And that saved my life. And so I'm getting choked up right now about that. And I was able to get on my phone and I sent her parents a text message. And I said, this is what's happening. This is what people are saying, that Nicole is saving lives, even when she's gone. Yeah. Her story is powerful and it matters. And so I just want your audience to know that, if you're struggling, if you're in a place where there's darkness, there is hope. And there are people who care, there are people who love, and there are people who have the resources to help you. And so just reach out. You don't have to go through this alone, because there are so many resources available, and there's so many people that want to help and that want to make a difference in your life, and you have a future. Suicide is not the answer. It's a permanent solution to a temporary issue. And so don't make that choice. You choose to live, because there are people who love you and people who care. And, you make that decision to live.
Yeah. First, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for sharing such a deep story, and my deepest sympathies for her loss. It's the loss of a tremendous light, but also the definition of the struggle that is very, very real. And she's going to continue to go on making a difference by those recordings and sharing in your documentary and helping first responders to understand the truth that it is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. Another thing that you brought up that I thought was so important, and I have to work with my first responders and other counselors on, and that's the setting of boundaries, and that you cannot leave your phone on 24 hours a day. You can't save everybody.
Right.
And I often have a challenge of trying to teach this to peer support teams, because they're out there and they're trying to make a difference, and they are making a difference. But self-care is not selfish. It's essential for you to be able to go on. When I do my peer support trainings, I try my best to let me do the extended version. The extended version adds a day, and it brings the peer support team families into the room. And I give them a voice and a vote. Your loved one is not only a police officer or a paramedic. They've stepped up to the plate to take on even more responsibility, and that is a heavier burden. So what I want to do is empower all of you to call the clinical director, and I believe in clinically directed peer support, so that there's a mental health clinician in charge of the thing, so it does not deteriorate into something. I've unfortunately had well-meaning people who pick up that phone all the time, help people to stay locked in their trauma, and I'm like, why didn't you call the clinical division? Well, he didn't want me to. She said I was needed to keep her secrets. I'm like, she was suicidal, or he was, headed that way. And there's no protocol in place, unfortunately, with a lot of peer support programs. So we endeavor to put protocols in place. One of those things is your family has a say in this, that the strength of your own individual family unit helps us to have a stronger peer support team. And then the numbers. It cannot be the same 6 people all the time picking up the phone. In an agency of 300, I try to get 30 or 40 people on the peer support team, broken down into teams of 12. So one team is on duty, one team is off duty and available, and the other team is completely out of service this month, so that they're making those baseball games with their kids. They're spending time with their family, and they're preserving, by example and by proof, their own mental health and keeping themselves mentally healthy by example. I don't believe that you're serving anyone to the best of your ability if your phone's on 24 hours a day.
Right.
I run 2 crisis response teams, and every now and then a police chief or fire chief's message goes to voicemail. And someone else in my agency picks it up. When I disengage and I'm sitting next to a fire, somewhere in a remote part of Texas or Colorado or New Mexico, that's where I am. One place in Colorado that I love dearly said, I don't know if you would want to have our cabins, because there's one problem. And I'm like, what's that? And he said, the internet doesn't work here. And I'm like, promise?
That's the one I want.
Exactly. And I try to get up there all the time. And my people know I've trained them well, and they know how to work with and work around it without me. That's also part of our legacy, training other people and finding clinicians that are clinically competent to help our members, training them. Training peer support teams to where they have the bench strength and the bandwidth and recognizing your limitation. And that you need to take time off. Self-care is not selfish.
And, self-care is something that was really front of mind for me once I got into this project. And this project, on top of my previous film, Heroine's Grip, both are pretty deep and dark subject matters. And so I knew that I needed to do something to take care of me. And so this past summer, May 15th, my buddy John and I began a bike ride, and we rode bicycles from the coast in Astoria, Oregon, all the way to Ocean City, Maryland. And we rode 3,400 miles. And it was an amazing journey. There were parts of the country where we did not have cell phone access, and that was amazing. Even though sometimes it was frustrating because our families couldn't get in touch with us. But it was a journey across the country for mental health, for myself, for my friend John, and for us to connect with first responders along the way, and just to see the country slow. And it really helped me better understand what it means to be present. For one reason, we had to be present and we had to be aware of our surroundings, because oftentimes we were on busy highways with big trucks coming by. So we had to be aware, had to be present, and couldn't be daydreaming because who knows what was coming from behind us. And so, but it taught me so much. And you asked me earlier, what's on the horizon for me. And so I'm actually in the process of writing a book. It's a personal development book, but it's based on our bike ride. And so I hope to have that finished sometime in the next year or so. So be on the lookout for that. So I'm really enjoying that. In fact, Fridays is my writing day. So Friday mornings I go off to a coffee shop and I spend several hours writing, and did that actually this morning. So that was a great experience.
Nice. I'm just assuming you're available and you do trainings and things of that nature. I'm available to,
I have my credit card will travel. We'll come to a city near you. And we've had the privilege of bringing the film around the country, and I'm willing to speak. Whoever wants to have me, I'd be honored to do that. And it's a privilege to be able to tell these stories and to share the little knowledge that I have about the subject matter. So I'd be happy to come to wherever you want me to come.
Okay. Are you scheduled for any upcoming conferences that we should be on the lookout for?
Not directly. We're working with some folks to make some plans for next year. We have a screening coming up in December up in New York. It kind of depends on when this show will air, but December 7th we'll be in New York City for a New York premiere, and we got some other screening events coming up in different parts of the country that we're working on for January, February, March of next year.
Okay. Any last minute or last words that you would, let me cut that, start it over. Mm-hmm. Are there any words that you would like to leave our members with? Any last thoughts as we start to wrap up this episode?
Yeah, I just want to say that, like I said earlier, you're not alone. There are resources available, and there is help available for you. No matter how dark and how broken you might seem to think you are, there is help. And I've seen it. I've seen people that have been in a very dark place come to a place of healing and wellness and wholeness. And so that is possible, that is available. And I just want to say thank you so much for having me on the program today. And thank you for being a first responder. Thank you for taking care of your communities. Thank you for, and also thank you for taking care of you, because that's important, to take care of you. So go out there and take care of yourself. Make that a priority, because if you're not healthy, it's going to be much more challenging to take care of others. So start with yourself. Take care of you.
Excellent message. Conrad Weaver, PTSD911movie.com. You owe it to yourself to give it a look, give it a watch, and learn all you can from this amazing documentarian, producer, and director. Conrad, thank you for being on this episode of Enroute. It was an honor and a privilege to have you join us today. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
I'm Joseph Brigandi. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Enroute. Enroute is a production of the First Responder Behavioral Health Institute. To learn more about us, head on over to frbhi.org.